What happens when your life begins to spiral? You notice all the warning signs, but you don't know what to do. My guest today has been through that experience, and he shares it with us here on this episode. Stay with us for Nick Wilson of the Resiliency Project.
You are a warrior.
321 status.
What kind of vehicle is it?
You are the very best your nation has to offer.
911.
Multiple shots fired.
They're asking you to lead.
5. We need a Bearcat.
It's up to us.
So 133. I need somebody that's got a visual on where the shooter is.
You must be sound in mind, body, and spirit.
42, where's the officer down? I have a rescue helicopter that wants to land and help.
This is the podcast that will make you the one.
Copy running eastbound.
The one that will bring everyone back.
Trouble, we have shots fired. Give me back up now.
Because no one else is coming.
We're going to have an officer shot. 100 block of East Street.
Suspect is down.
This is the Squad Room.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Squad Room Podcast, where we learn to serve, strive, and succeed in our challenging careers. My name is Garrett Tesla. I'm an active duty sergeant for a sheriff's office in Southern California, and I'm on a mission to build a world where first responders wake up inspired, feel confident at work, and go home safe knowing they've spent their time in a worthy cause. We have a great episode for today, but before we get to our guest, I want to remind you that you can support the show and rock some cool gear by visiting our apparel line at aworthycauselife.com. And please check us out on Facebook or Instagram at aworthycauselife. There are a couple of ways to stay connected to this podcast too, of course, to make sure you do get as much out of these episodes and as much value as you can. First off, like our Facebook page and join our Facebook group of active and aspiring law enforcement professionals. Just search the Squad Room group on Facebook to join. And of course, follow me on Instagram at the Squad Room to keep up on the socials. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us. If this is your first episode, please, I think this is a great episode to be introduced to the show through. My guest today is Nick Wilson. Nick is the founder of the Resiliency Project. You can learn more about him on Instagram at @the_Resiliency Project or on his website, theresiliencyproject.info. Nick does a great job of telling his story on the show and during the interview, so I'm not going to give it away here, but his story is terrifying. And it's heartbreaking. It's also shocking. And I imagine that a lot of people, when they hear a story like this, their immediate reaction is to judge Nick and put distance between a situation like this and their own values and opinions. But if that's how you would normally approach a story about a cop who fell on hard times and began to self-destruct, I want to encourage you to listen closely and seek ways of understanding what he went through. Because I think all of us can relate to this story in some way. And if we can relate to it, that means it could happen to us as well. So enjoy this interview with Nick Wilson of the Resiliency Project after this message. This episode is sponsored by Signature Coins. For months now, I've been looking for a way to say thank you to my guests and supporters. And after being involved in a major international incident recently, I was given quite a few challenge coins. And I was surprised at how much each of those meant to me. So I decided to make a Squad Room challenge coin to share with guests and supporters. I went searching for a company who could meet my high standards, but I was still nervous about making a purchase like this online. Most challenge coins you order these days are ordered online, produced in a factory far, far away, and tracking down someone in customer service can be, well, a challenge. And I'll admit that I'm kind of old school, and I prefer to look someone in the eye when I'm about to spend that much money. So I delayed on a decision on a vendor for a long time, until I found Signature Coins out of Florida. Turns out some of the guys at Signature Coins actually listened to the show, and when I contacted them, we connected immediately on our shared purpose of honoring this profession that I love so much. Daniel, Trey, Jeff, and all the other guys at Signature immediately put me at ease with making such a big purchase, and they bent over backwards to make sure that the coin I wanted that was in my head came out as a reality that I'm now holding in my hand. Now, if you're like me and you haven't drawn anything since it involved a crayon, have no fear. Signature Coins has 30 graphic artists on staff right in their Orlando office to help, and they don't charge a single penny to get your artwork ready for production. That is a big difference from other companies that often charge an artwork fee, or maybe you have to hire an outside designer. Signature Coins does all the art for free with no obligation to buy. They also have inclusive pricing, meaning that you're not going to get hit with a hidden upcharge at checkout. a 100% guarantee on their craftsmanship, and free next day shipping in the U.S. And their customer service team is right there in Orlando. Their turnaround is quick, about 2 weeks, which is super fast for coins. And like I said, free next day shipping when your coins are ready to go out the door. I couldn't be happier with my coins, and I couldn't be happier that I got them from Signature Coins. If you're looking to make a challenge coin of your own, you can find out more about them at signaturecoins.com or email info@signaturecoins.com, and Jeff will hook you up with a quote. If you use the coupon code TheSquadRoom, you'll get $50 off your first order. Learn more at signaturecoins.com. Nick Wilson, welcome to the Squad Room. Thanks for being here, Nick.
Thank you very much for having me. Very grateful to be on your show, Garrett.
Oh, I mean, I'm excited to have you. We connected up through, I'm not sure how originally, but you and I had a phone conversation like a couple weeks ago, probably a little bit more than that, a couple weeks ago. And, we talked for like 45 minutes and we had a really great conversation. And I just knew that you were a guy, after that conversation, I knew you were a guy who I wanted to have on the show, and also a guy that was really out there in the parlance of my show, being the one, and leading the way on a topic that is really, really important these days. And I'll let you talk here in a minute, I promise. But I'm just thinking in anticipation of the episode today about we're at the end of the year. There's like, I don't know if it's a thing, but COVID fatigue, of dealing with it both at work and on the street and at home, and for those of us with kids, dealing with the kids and their issues. So I think this conversation couldn't be more timely when we talk about resilience, and we talk about it from the perspective of getting it back. So that's why I'm excited to have you on today.
Well, thank you. No, all good points and excited to discuss.
So I wanted to start with your story. You're medically retired at this point from law
Yep.
enforcement, but I was curious, going back, I always loved to find out, why did you get into law enforcement in the first place?
Well, I was wanted to always be a soccer player when I was a kid, and that's quite unpopular, I know, in the United States. But I grew up playing soccer, and when my mother was remarried, we moved to Northern California, and when I was up there, I met a police officer. In fact, I was having a bad day after um, a day at high school, and this police officer named Dave Porter from a small town that I lived in pulled up. My initial inclination was to think he's going to come and harass me or something like that, but he came just to check to see how I was doing. He let me look inside his police car and asked me if I ever wanted to be a cadet, and never gave it a thought or never considered that an option. And I actually joined the Explorer program when I was 15 years old, and really fell in love with the profession. I I rode along when police cars Friday and Saturday night every weekend, and knew that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So went to the academy when I was 20, and got hired shortly thereafter and started my police career.
So you, here in California, you have to be 21 in order to have your full peace officer powers. You like started on day one of your eligibility.
It was no, I started.
Or
I
roughly
graduated in the academy when I was. I went in when I was 20. I graduated when I was 21, and
21. Yeah.
it was
Mhm.
about 21 and a half or 22 is when I finally ended up getting hired. And that was at a community college district in San Diego before lateraling up to Orange County.
Okay, and so you eventually lateral up into an agency there. There's a ton of agencies in the LA area. You don't have to name your agency, but give us an idea of the size and the kind of the scope, and then kind of the stuff you did while you were there.
Yeah, so it was in Orange County, and population was approximately 85,000, about 8 square miles, and small city but busy city uh, that bordered and neighbored LA County agencies, and had a great time when I was on patrol. Loved it, loved the people that I worked with, and was fortunate enough to go into the Special Investigations Unit where I was working as a narcotic and gang detective. And I stayed there. was able to be on the SWAT team. I was really, really fortunate to be a field training officer, and my career got cut short based on physical injuries, but also beyond that were issues that I had to deal with from traumatic events that I saw and dealt with on the job that I never dealt with.
And so, how much time total from when you moved into that Orange County agency to when you eventually retired?
I lateraled at 2008 and I retired at the end of 2017. So
9 years, about 9 years.
9 years, yeah.
So, for people who aren't familiar, with the LA area, because everybody thinks LA is one just giant glob of people, but
Right,
in that area, you have dozens and dozens of agencies, dozens of jurisdictional borders that meet up with each other. I mean, in an agency down there, you could deal with, not necessarily talking about your specific agency, but any agency down there. You may deal with two or three other municipal agencies or county sheriff's departments in any given shift, given whatever border you might be on.
sure, yeah,
And yeah, and your criminal element there aren't just the locals, right? They come,
right,
they cross those borders, so you're dealing with a lot of Los Angeles's best criminals and Orange County's best criminals in that environment,
sure,
and it's a hopping department, right?
right, yeah,
Um, I
absolutely,
know we're not gonna say the department, but I know the department, and I know that they're humping it. They're busy,
yeah,
and you even the quote unquote. Now it's funny because in California that's like a mid-sized to small agency,
sure,
uh, but in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, that's a massive agency to other people.
yeah,
So
sure, yeah.
that
Yeah,
so
having originally started out at a small agency, to me at the time it seemed, it was huge, um,
yeah.
but definitely busy.
hmm And so 9 years across patrol and then
Right,
special investigations, narcotics gangs. You're dealing with like legit gangsters down there,
right,
legit narcotics movement, that sort of stuff. And you just touched on it. You brushed up on it about some medical issues and some injuries.
right,
But those are the physical things. Those are physical things that happen to you, and I've struggled with some of those too myself. But
sure.
what are those other things that you're talking about?
Yeah, so you know, when I started out as a police officer or my career in law enforcement, I never considered or understood the psychological impacts, the impacts of trauma that can be sustained from a profession in law enforcement. And that's by and large due to the culture. And so for me, I started noticing that I was dealing with a considerable amount of stress and trauma. I didn't really know what was wrong with me, other than I couldn't sleep. And as a result of not being able to sleep for some reason, uh, for the first time ever in my life, I knew that something wasn't right. I knew that um, I was dealing with a lot of anxiety based on a lot of things that were going on in my assignment and work. And after a while, my cup really became full. And I can go into detail about those things, but um, you know, I started declining, and I really had no idea what was going on with me. And so after about a year of going through a sleep clinic and study at my doctor, I was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And because of the stigma that exists in law enforcement, um, I was mortified and I was embarrassed. And so things really changed after that.
What? Yeah, you offered to dig in, and you're always very open when I see you talk and when we talk. What are the things that you were dealing with
Sure,
that either were obvious or only in hindsight you
sure.
realized were the massive issues?
Yeah, looking back on it now, when I'm, especially with what I'm doing now, I'm pretty critical of myself, and I often look back and think, what could I have done, but what I was going through was the lack of sleep became very difficult. And one day would turn into 2 days, sometimes even 3 days of not sleeping. Um, I noticed that I started having nightmares. I noticed that I started experiencing what I now know to be hypervigilance, um, looking back on it. And based on the diagnosis and really looking back on how I was living and the way that I looked at life, the way that I viewed the world, I then became very withdrawn and I started isolating in my personal life and in my professional life. And so, um, you know, after a couple of surgeries from injuries that I got from working, I started taking Norcos, narcotic pain medication, and somas. And at the end of my sleeping treatment, when they finally diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, they started prescribing me benzodiazepines. And so that was the first time that I'd ever taken a benzo or knew. And even though I was working narcotics, it's like I didn't know what the consequences would be for long-term use of that. I just thought that I was at that time invincible and I could handle it. But unfortunately, I became chemically dependent after a while. And between my inability to cope with traumatic events or critical incidents that were just boiling over, things I'd never dealt with, I began to self medicate. That's how I became chemically dependent, which really compounded my sleeping problems. Um, typically we start self-medicating, and we think it takes the edge off, or we start having some drinks, but it really became problematic when that was my only way of coping and dealing with the stressors that I was experiencing on the job. So as a result of that, I ended up um, becoming so dependent on medication and drinking when I would run out of medication that I ended up getting in my car one night when I was working on a task force. And this was shortly after the San Bernardino terrorist attack. I ended up crashing into a fence. I totaled my car and I received a DUI. And that single handedly changed the ball game for me in my life. And that was in 2016. You want me to
So
elaborate?
obviously, yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
We'll dig into each part of this because I think that there's lessons to be learned and teased out of each portion of this, right? And so
Right.
I think any cop with more than a day on understands the difficulty of sleeping, or and how challenging that can be. I mean, if you're a new guy, usually you're put on the graveyard shift
Right.
or on the worst shift available, which usually involves darkness, and
Sure. Sure.
and your body's just not meant for that.
Yeah.
And I'd also just think we are really just now in the last 5 years or so understanding how much sleep is disrupted by the stress and that hypervigilance you talk about.
Sure.
And so, a lot of us go into it thinking we're young, we're in good shape, I'm good to go.
Right.
And we just chalk it up to the fact that we're trying to sleep in the middle of the day when the gardeners are here or the
Right.
kids are at home or, whatever else is going on in the world. And we push down or ignore the other warning signs that are out there.
Right.
And so I'm curious with because hindsight being 2020, right? You probably didn't see these things at the time, but the
Mm-hmm.
the inability to sleep, what was that the result of for you, do you think?
I think it's from untreated trauma. I think
Hmm.
it's cumulative stress and trauma that I was experiencing on the job. I think it was a lot of different factors. Um, I was involved in, and I was grateful to be involved in these investigations that taught me a lot. And I worked with an amazing crew, um, usually with different agencies as well. But it was during these times that my trauma started in patrol. Um, And I think that when I look back at the entire sequence of events. I have to look at the culture, and I have to understand, for myself when I was going through my own recovery, you know, how did this whole thing happen? How did someone who was very resilient and a uh, type of personality, how did I lose everything? How did I go down the drain and so quickly without being able to stop it? Um, and so, law enforcement is a very peer-driven environment, and you have to rely on your peers for survival purposes. But in that, there is a lot of judgment, and there is, um, you look to your peers for survival, and there's a constant analysis, and uh, there's a constant, I would say, it's just a very judgmental environment, and you're
Mm-hmm.
constantly trying to prove to your peers through whether it's the academy or field training, or getting into a special assignment. You're constantly having to prove yourself, and that's fun, and that's part of the profession. However, it also creates this environment where stigma is very real, and so each time I responded to a critical incident or was involved in a critical incident, or any of my partners were, I remember distinctly if one of my partners asked if I was okay, I'd say, "Yep, I'm good," and vice versa. And I didn't realize until later how dangerous that is, because I think what happened with me was I was going through a lot, and I constantly looked around me to see if anyone else was experiencing what I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the stigma, and by and large, we all kind of just look at our partners and say, "Yep, I'm good." Um, you start to feel invalidated, and a lot of the research, or, I'm not a clinician, but a lot of the research that I cite comes from Dr. John Violanti, who's written a lot of books on police trauma. And,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I learned is that from the academy, the onset of things, the law enforcement traditionally has had to create police officers that are to feel invincible. They have to go into unknown scenarios and situations on a daily basis and go into them expecting a positive outcome. And when that illusion of invulnerability is shattered later in a police officer, um, or deputy sheriff's career, anyone in law enforcement or the first responder community, it is incongruent with what we've always known. And so for me, I started becoming more and more vulnerable in my career, meaning that I, as time passed, stopped feeling this Superman complex that I was invincible, and the reality that I was vulnerable to the symptoms of post traumatic stress. It went against everything I ever understood previously,
Mm-hmm.
which caused me to isolate and to feel very embarrassed. And I think a combination of experiencing that, not knowing who to turn to or how to seek help, started a pathway of maladaptive coping, high risk behavior, and emotionally distancing myself completely, not just physically from my family, but emotionally, and doing everything I could to just check out. And so I think that's where it all started for me, because aside from the sleeping issues and the anxiety, it was almost as if every new traumatic event or stressful scenario that I was experiencing at work re-traumatized past critical incidents that I never dealt with, leaving that area of untreated trauma a very dangerous place. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. And you touched on a couple good points. One I want to go back to before I want to make sure I touch on, the when something happens and the partners look at each other and you good? Yeah, I'm good.
Right.
How many hundreds of times a day does that happen
Yeah.
across the country or any country?
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately, too much, right?
and I equate that sometimes, and it's well intentioned, I think,
Sure.
right? But it's also in a way kind of like when you pass someone on the street and you just kind of involuntarily say, "How you doing?"
Right.
And you expect the answer to be fine
Right.
or good or some version of that, and they respond, "How are you?" "Fine, thank you," and you move on, right? And you may
Right.
never see this person again. And the expectation through social norms is that they don't unload their life on you when you ask how you doing.
Right.
We
Absolutely.
don't really want to know. We're being polite and we're being nice when we say, "How you doing?" "Good." And I think
Sure.
internally we all think, just subconsciously we think, "Oh, phew, good. They didn't unload on me with their drama," right? And
Right.
you move on
Right.
about your day.
Sure.
We do the same thing in that exact same scenario when we look at our partners and say, "You good?" Because
Right.
just there in the question, what if you're not?
Absolutely.
And what if the just the tone and everything else about that question is
Hmm.
prompting you to answer, "Yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. I got
Yeah.
this."
Absolutely.
And
Sure.
so, how would you want someone to ask that question of you? Like, if you could go back in time and to get someone to really get to the core of it and to give you the courage to speak to that truthfully, how would they ask that question?
That's a great question. I know that there were people that at times asked me if I was okay, if I was good. Uh, there were people who saw changes in me over time. I don't know if they could have done anything different at the time. I do know now that you if if I could go back in time and I saw someone who was struggling, I would do everything I could to pull them aside and say, hey, brother or sister, how are you doing? What are you feeling? What's going on with you? I noticed some changes in you, and no judgment whatsoever. Just want to know how I can help, kind of thing. When you approach it and ask a question that's not just a yes or no,
Hmm.
how are you feeling? I know that this becomes, people roll their eyes, but you know, uh, I think that the profession has become so incredibly difficult, and law enforcement officers, not just in California but across the country, are struggling and dealing with so much right now that it might be worth it to spend a little extra time checking on your partners. It's kind of like what you were talking about. It's almost like an involuntary response, right? It's like muscle memory. Just, yep, fine, I'm good.
Hmm.
But I think we have to start, in my opinion, as a culture, do more to try to check on our partners, those especially that um, we see factors or behavioral changes that might be indicative of some sort of trauma, whether it's in their behavior or you know
Hmm.
absenteeism or so. I think to be honest, I don't know if someone could have changed my response at the time because of the
Hmm.
stigma and how powerful the stigma was.
Hmm.
I just know that there's a lot more we could do in terms of addressing it and asking probing questions where we're not letting our partners feel as though we're judging them, right? Um, the safer our police officers feel in speaking about their struggles, the more of an opportunity we have to help them cope with untreated trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine you'll agree with this idea that it's what we it's almost without question that if you're in the profession that you have some element of the ability to be courageous.
Sure.
And many of my partners have done very extremely courageous things that involve some sort of feat of physicality or mental strength that has made the news or given them an award or saved a life or all these things that cops are known for doing that are courageous. But I
Sure.
think the one thing we could do to really be better to each other is the willingness to have courageous conversations
Absolutely.
and being especially incumbent on anyone who considers themselves to be a leader
Sure.
to be willing to ask difficult questions, but take it from the point of being courageous and seeking to help your fellow officer find the courage to talk,
Absolutely.
So it comes down to questions like, are you sleeping? How's
Right.
the drinking? Have you and your wife gone on a date recently? Or
Sure.
how are things at home? How are your kids doing?
Right.
And having conversations like that, if we can get more people who are in leadership positions, and listen to this show, I consider anyone who listens to this to be a leader.
Sure.
Uh, these people into a converse to be able to have the courage that they have on the street, put that into a conversation with a partner that you would die for, right? I mean,
Right.
these are people we have agreed that we would go out and step in front of a bullet for.
Absolutely.
Uh, but at the same time, with that insane amount of courage that we all agree on, explicitly, implicitly, none of us are willing to have those tough conversations.
Right.
And so that's where that starts to me. That's where
Absolutely.
I think we start is
A-
we start with ourselves and being willing to be the one to ask hard questions of our friends.
Agreed. And it is almost as though, when you really think about it in lines of exactly what you're saying, um, our officers like I did, we abandon ourselves. We're always there for
Mm-hmm.
our partners. We're there for strangers in the community that we don't even know. Right. And so being able to sacrifice so much for others instead of looking inward and being there for yourself is something that we have to start to acknowledge. And,
Mm,
you know, for me, I believe that there are a lot of different things that can be done to change the culture, but I think so much of it, when we're talking about officer wellness, we have to look at our law enforcement leaders, and we look to them from an organizational standpoint for their leadership in setting a new tone that initiates or supports or promotes anything having to do with wellness and getting rid of stigma. Because when that happens, you create a culture in your agency that normalizes the process of seeking help. It's so easy for us, isn't it, to get a physical injury and be out for a few weeks or a month to recover from that. But when it comes to a psychological injury, it is an uncomfortable thing because of the profession and the stigma.
mm-hmm.
A police officer's template is a one that is typically points towards justice and benevolence. They're inherently good. Of course, there's bad apples, and those people should be weeded out. They don't deserve to wear the badge. But our officers have a um, role in making sure that they're there for everybody else. It becomes part of the lifestyle. And between that and the fear of potentially feeling inadequate amongst your
Mm-hmm.
peers if you're not okay is the you know the debacle in law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we change that? How do we change the culture? For me, I was so embarrassed of ever discussing or talking about anything that was bothering me, because I would have felt at the time, I remember distinctly thinking that others, whether it's in my family or my partners, would lose faith in me. Um, and that's a very dangerous way of thinking, because
Mm-hmm.
it's absolutely, um, to me, it's insane to think that police officers who have to deal with the worst in our society, seeing people on their worst day, experiencing critical incident after critical incident, cumulatively, the compassion fatigue, the adrenal fatigue, the stress hormones that are, you know, depleting our bodies. There are multiple factors that change the way that we operate. And I think that if we start looking at psychological injuries as a physical injury, it's a good starting point to be had. And this isn't just about suicide prevention. This is about, the alarming stats that we see with divorces and substance abuse and alcoholism in law enforcement. And that leads to the vicarious trauma that bleeds into the family home life and oftentimes deteriorates and destructs the family structure, which is, absolutely devastating, because we know that the best way to heal from post-traumatic stress is from community. It's from your social structures, your family structure, that kind of support. It's not found in a medication. It's not found in a Band-Aid, or it's not found while isolating or numbing yourself out. It's found in community and self-care. And so, go ahead.
No, I don't want to stop you. Sorry, but I want to talk about your recovery and all that. But I want to go back real quick and touch on two questions I had, because I'm just curious. So you talk about being out in the street and going to critical incidents, but was your situation where you have a defined, like, the event that caused or tripped your PTSD, or was it a cumulative issue?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's both. Okay, because I think, from what we know from post-traumatic stress, it can be cumulative. It can be, one specific event. For me, while I was working as a detective, I was working white supremacy organizations, and they issued a green light to kill me. I started dealing with the impacts of that. That case lasted quite a few years. And so there was a constant feeling of hypervigilance, constant feeling of being in a threat zone from unknown, circumstances. And that prolonged exposure to hypervigilance, coupled with a significant amount of traumatic events from my past that, culminated after several years. I think after the threat, that was my boiling point. And that's when I became most self-destructive. So had I caught it on earlier, had I changed things earlier, the outcome of my life probably would have been different. So I always tell officers when I speak to them now, there is absolutely no shame in getting help. We can't repeat our patterns as a law enforcement community as we have in our past. We have to create a new environment, in my opinion, if I may say so, to allow officers to feel safe in coming forward to get help, and that doing so is a sign of strength, not weakness, not whatsoever. And so, in fact, I actually spoke to a gentleman a few hours ago who went to treatment, both for trauma and for chemical dependency. Was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and is back at his agency and working. This is far more common than we might think. Of course, it has to do with agency culture, but just because you have a psychological injury doesn't mean it's the end. It's when we wait too long to get the help that we need. The more we wait, the more we lose. And I retired on my back, my arm, from injuries that I sustained that affect me daily. But it was the psychological trauma, the untreated trauma, that really changed the course of events for me in my life. And so I wish I would have done more to change it. I can just do as much as I can now to try to help change it for others.
In ancient Rome, soldiers would step into battle to fight for the empire, but they also had bills to pay and family back home to support. Doesn't that sound familiar? Well, if soldiers performed well in battle, they would be paid in gold coins. If they performed with exceptional valor, they would be given an extra coin. Legend has it that this coin was often minted with the name and symbol of the legion in which they served, and that soldiers would hold on to these coins as proof of their bravery. This made their coins a prized possession. Throughout history, unique coins have been part of nearly every warrior tradition. There's a story from World War I in which an American pilot was held captive as a German POW and stripped of all of his personal identification. He escaped the POW camp but was detained by the French, who thought he was a German spy. He carried with him a coin with a symbol that one of the French soldiers recognized as that of an American squadron. The coin saved his life. Challenge coins remain an important part of this warrior tradition, including those in law enforcement and the other first responder professions. Signature Coins out of Orlando, Florida is my choice for challenge coins for the squad room. Their staff of artists can create and make most any design a reality, and their quality is top-notch. The people at Signature Coins are complete professionals like you, and they take their jobs seriously. Quality is their priority, and I can tell you that it shows in the squad room coins that I ordered from them. You can check out their handiwork on my Instagram at the Squad Room. For more information or to get a free quote with no artwork fee, check out their website at signaturecoins.com. If you use the coupon code The Squad Room, you can get $50 off your first order. That's signaturecoins.com. Now, back to the show. I want to, not to continue on this path, but I just think this is so crucial for people to understand how this begins. And so I think anyone understanding that you get greenlit, everyone gets understands the stress of something like that.
Sure.
And what you would go through. But I'm curious, I guess I have hours and hours of questions, but I'm curious about what were, at the time that you got the diagnosis, what were you doing in terms of your physical health and your mental health that you thought were either you thought you were doing the right things to be preventative or that you were doing to relieve the stress, or what do you realize you should have been doing at the time?
Sure. So first, I never had a hobby ever. I never had anything else other than law enforcement that gave me purpose, which is not healthy whatsoever.
Yeah, no.
I identified with the job. The badge was my identity. And so outside of law enforcement, there was nothing else that I did that I truly, truly loved. I did exercise, especially when I was on the team. I was exercising and, working out, watching my nutrition, but things changed after the injuries. But when I thought that I was starting to get healthier from the injury before my arm injury, I noticed that I just stopped working out. And on my days off, I became isolated. I never considered anything having to do with self-care, believing or understanding that it could have made a difference. I never subscribed to going to therapy because I thought it would be weak of me. It's not even something that I understood. So there were a lot of factors. What I was doing when I started to slip to the point where it became very concerning was that I started self-medicating. I didn't know how to deal with the rigors of the job, the pain of the job, and what I was seeing and what many of my partners were seeing. I just couldn't, after a while of not dealing with it, I couldn't deal with it anymore. And so the only way that I knew how to survive was by self-medicating. And I knew when I became chemically dependent. I remember what that was like. I remember feeling deathly afraid of the fact that I wasn't going to have a good outcome. And I didn't know how to get help. And I didn't know how to do so in a way that would preserve, my job. And so, I wanted to be known that this was all my fault. right? You can't blame this on anybody else. I'm the one that chose to put anything in my mouth or drink anything to numb myself out. But looking back, I wish I would have had more purpose outside of the profession. I wish that I would have had a more well balanced life, that I would have put more emphasis on self care, that I would have done more to take care of my mental health, to protect it, because it's um, it's unimaginable for anybody to assume that a police officer could go through the kinds of trauma that police officers have to go through in serving their communities without being unscathed psychologically. Um, I became very cynical. I stopped having faith in society, the way that I saw the world, my role within it. I didn't have long-term goals that I really, really believed in at the time because I just was trying to live day by day. And so it's difficult to discuss because, I know that there are a lot of people out there right now that are hurting and don't know where to turn or how to get help. And the only thing I can say is, there are a lot of options out there, and that doing so only defines you as a warrior.
Well put. So you passed. It sounds like you're self-aware of the spiral you're in, but
Right.
you don't know how to pull up on that yoke to
Correct.
to kind of level out. And so it's almost like you foresaw the implosion that eventually occurred, literally into a fence when you totaled your car,
Right.
and a DUI that resulted. And what was that the wake up moment where everything changed and everything shifted, or did it take longer until you realized that you couldn't do this anymore?
No, I knew. I knew the second it happened, and I've said it before. I I distinctly remember after the crash thinking to myself, um, my first thought was, not to thank God that I'm still alive or uninjured. It wasn't to thank God that I didn't hurt anybody. My first thought was everyone's gonna know it's over,
Mm.
and that's powerful because the stigma of in law enforcement is so strong. It might not be, you know, experienced by everybody, but by and large, stigma is very prevalent. I I knew from that point forward, especially because I had my son at the time, um, who was born and at home, meaning he wasn't with me, but he had come into the world, and I needed to be the best father I could be. I knew I needed to get help. I just didn't know what that meant, and it was scary as hell because there was an intervention at my home by some friends, colleagues, and family members at the time. And I uh, I went into treatment a few weeks after the crash, and it took a lot of different factors, but the strongest one I could say was the sergeant, who was the arresting sergeant that night, um, pulled me aside. I was completely broken down and apologizing for crashing and putting his officers in a position to arrest me. I was ashamed of myself. And I distinctly remember him saying to me as he pulled me aside that I needed to ask for help. It's okay. He knew of my situation before, but this was the first time that I had ever met him. And it was in that context of a sergeant who was very distinguished in his career telling me that it was okay to get help. And so it made it a lot easier and acceptable for me a couple weeks later during the intervention for me to say yes. And his name is Chuck Dominguez, and grateful that just a few years later, he is on my board for the Resiliency Project. And so for me, I feel like I watched myself spiral, was lying to myself, telling me that I was going to be okay and would get through it. But it was an excuse, and it took a lot of loss for me to be able to start a pathway or a journey of healing. And that happened. That happened after the DUI, and I shortly after the intervention that night, I went into treatment. It took 7 days to detox off of everything, and I spent 30 days there in inpatient, which is where I met a bunch of other police officers who were also in inpatient treatment with me from different agencies. That was the first time I ever thought, wow, I'm not alone. This is a little bit more common than I thought. And after that, I went to a trauma retreat called WCPR up in Northern California, which changed my life. So there's a lot in that.
Yeah, there's and the West was it West Coast Post Trauma Retreat? Is that what it is?
Right. Yeah,
Which
WCPR West Coast Post Trauma Retreat.
Post Trauma Retreat, which is run by Joel Fay,
It is.
or partially run by Joel Fay, who was a guest, one of my first guests actually on this show.
Yeah, he's a great
Uh,
guy.
he is, and a great guy, great leader, police psychologist, former police officer himself.
Right.
Um, you know, when I hear your story, and really there are many similar stories out there. Like you said, you went into rehab and realized that you weren't the only one there.
Sure.
I think the first, there's a saying that if you find yourself deep in a hole, the first thing you got to do is to stop digging
Right.
and stop making the problem worse.
Right.
And after a DUI arrest, I see there's two paths that you could possibly take, or any person could possibly take. One is you just double down on that shame and that anger and that fear,
Mm-hmm.
and you just shut everybody off and you drink yourself away or overdose, or
Sure.
you accept the help. But in order
Sure.
to accept the help, you have to stop the digging, and you have to take at least some sort of self-assessment. What was the first thing you did to stop digging?
Well, it came down to my son. My son
Mm,
was just he's a year and a half, two, uh, about a year and a half, and he was my reason for living. He was my reason for everything, and so I
mhm,
put him at the focal point of everything that I did, um, because I didn't want to have the kind of father that I had growing up. I didn't want to be an absentee father. I didn't want to be checked out. When he came into the world, I had depleted so much. I'd deteriorated so much. I wasn't even responsive for um, lots of times during the first year of his life. And
mhm,
so, for me, I was tired of suffering. There's just a lot of pain and suffering in the law enforcement profession with varying degrees. People work at different places, and there's different environments, but by and large, being in law enforcement is a very difficult profession. It's inherently, one of the most difficult jobs on the planet. And so I had to find my reason, my purpose. For me, it was my son. For others, I've heard tons of amazing stories of recovery and resilience, and the fortitude that it takes to start a path of healing. And when you can find purpose for changing and living, it can change the ball game. And I think that it took a lot during my recovery and understanding how to implement and practice self-care. I know it sounds crazy, but to understand mindfulness,
mhm,
mindfulness meditation, all of these different things that have helped me. Um, I don't live in the same way that I used to, and I always tell people as well. We can't think of healing by believing in some sort of utopia where there's like this end goal. It's like a constant daily practice, and some days are much more difficult than others, and that's okay as long as you can
mhm.
catch yourself and you can respond more effectively based on how much you know of yourself, and how, by identifying what's bothering you and responding in a manner that is not self-destructive. For me, it took a lot of practice, but I couldn't. I knew that I couldn't go backwards, or I'd lose my son. So that was my reason. Um,
Mm.
I wish it, you know, at the time, everyone says, well, you got to do it for yourself, no, for no one else. But when you don't have hope, you got to cling on to something. And I say, you know what, just cling on to something,
Yeah.
because the trauma work and healing, there's no script for this. There's not, because there's then personal life and the personal stressors in everyone's lives that also exacerbate the stressors that people experience on the job. There's childhood trauma. There's a lot of different factors, and so the more emphasis placed on um, self-care and healing and these things, the more effective you can become. You know.
Do you think after going through rehab and then going through the West Coast post trauma retreat, after all that, do you think you had an alcohol and drug problem, or you had a trauma problem that
Yeah.
showed up as an alcohol and drug outlet or activity?
Great, great question. Great question that could have a whole nother segment into the treatment industry for first responders and culturally
Right.
competent clinicians, right? But so initially, I was like, I definitely a drug and alcohol problem, which kind of was inconsistent with what my e- everything told me, like, I'm not an alcoholic, but I had to essentially believe or understand, when you go into treatment, the first thing that you say is, hi, my name's Nick and I'm an alcoholic. But it just seems so crazy to me because after I detoxed, although I was feeling everything for the first time because I was clear and didn't have any medications or alcohol in my body, um, you know, it was more difficult to talk about things because I wasn't emotionally numbing out, but I didn't have a need to emotionally numb out. I understood that it was going to be difficult and I had to push through. And I just had to do so in a way that I didn't understand before, and I had to learn tools to do it. At the end of the day, for me, no, I don't have a drug and alcohol problem. It was untreated trauma that led to chemical dependency through maladaptive coping. It was all about my inability to cope because I didn't have the techniques or the strategies to do it, and I became chemically dependent. And when that happened, especially with the benzodiazepine, that led to my eventual downfall. There's a lot I could have done, and I didn't because it was so foreign to me at the time.
Mm.
But there's a lot our officers can do so that they don't find themselves in the same predicament that I found myself in, which eventually cost me everything and the loss of my family. At the time, my wife, she asked for divorce and left with my son. And so I had to rebuild my whole life. And I put my son first, and I had to think that way every single day. And every day that I did, although it was difficult, I started seeing more clearly. And here we are now on your awesome podcast. So I never thought I'd be here, or teaching, or having awesome colleagues that I work with every day. But there is hope.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's hope, and so let's talk about that. You now have started, as part of your mission and part of your own recovery, the Resiliency Project,
Yeah,
and people can learn more about that at the resiliencyproject.info. Um, but talk about what your mission is now, and also what you're teaching other people to do that you're using to be successful in the aftermath of it.
sure. And thank you for asking. So the Resiliency Project is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to end the silent suffering of our nation's first responders and provide peer support and funding for treatment, whether it's recovery or psychological services, in an effort to treat post-traumatic stress, build resilience, and end suicide
Mm.
uh, of our first responders. So for us, we take peer support calls when first responders go through the website in the event that they don't feel comfortable going to their own agency or utilizing their own agency's peer support, or maybe they don't have one. And so we have peer supporters on our team that are awesome. And we also, I teach a wellness course for Post, and that's a peer driven course that I just started and actually being hosted at the Chino Police Department. The next 3 classes, we just had a couple there, and this is about stigma. This is about leadership in law enforcement, how to change the culture from a psychoeducational standpoint, how to understand the symptoms and signs of PTSD or PTSI, as I like to say, because it is a psychological injury. And um, the more we can inspire officers to start speaking from line level to command staff, the more of an opportunity that we have to change the culture, because it goes against everything that we've ever done before, right? We just typically say nothing and everything is all good. And these are principles that I've adhered to that I learned at WCPR. Um, that's where my true healing journey began. And so being fortunate to have been a former law enforcement officer and having the experiences that I've had, um, I'm grateful in that I've been able to connect with officers during the class who have had the same experiences that I've had or have struggled in any capacity, and they know that when they're in the class that they're safe and that there's no judgment and that it is peer driven, and um, the point of it is to get people talking and to see things from a different perspective. And I think that that is different from a different type of instructor. Um, and so I'm grateful for that. It I'm grateful to be able to connect with, it's not just it's dispatchers, it's correctional officers, it's um, line level all the way up to chiefs and sheriffs. And so I see a lot of change in the culture happening, and that is more inspiring than ever. And there's a lot of work to be done. However, I do see change happening incrementally, and I just hope that, especially with everything going on now, that the rest of the country can start to follow suit. Unfortunately, there are a lot of agencies and pockets of the country that are very, very far behind in terms of wellness, and I've heard, very difficult things that have
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Oh
that
yeah.
I wish I
Oh
didn't
yeah.
hear.
I want to point out something too, because you touched on it, but you mentioned Sergeant Chuck Dominguez, who was there at the scene of your arrest the night you crashed your car, and he's now on the board of your foundation, which I think is a great show of support and says volumes about the man and his
Yes, it
willingness
does.
to not write someone off for a bad decision, which I think cops often are very quick to do. You
Right.
know, we write off the criminals and that's okay, but we often write off our own at times.
Absolutely.
But on top of the fact that you had Sergeant Dominguez involved here, you mentioned that the Chino Police Department here in California, is hosting the class and has hosted the class, and explain why that's cool.
Well, that's cool because that's the that's the agency that arrested me, and
Yeah.
and the fact that they would, as you're saying these things and speaking, it chokes me up even now, which I feel comfortable saying because I get very emotional in the class, especially when I'm telling my story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I never thought that I would be here, and never thought that a day would come where I would ever step foot inside of the Chino Police Department or any department. I believe that I was shunned from the law enforcement community, and so how grateful am I? I mean, I'm, Chuck is like a brother to me, under the leadership of Wes Simmons at Chino PD and Nick Murata, Chuck Dominguez. Um, these people are very forward thinking in their strategies to implement wellness programs, and so they've given me a shot. And I've met countless other leaders, not just in California but around the country, who are of the same mindset, which is inspiring to see. And the other members of the Resiliency Project, Jeff and Adam Grugel, just awesome police officers. Um, you know, Chuck Dominguez, Jaime, who I don't want to say his last name because he works UC operations and human trafficking task force. Jeremy Cross, our admin team, who are either first responders themselves or spouses of law enforcement. These people are so dedicated, and I'm blessed to have a team of colleagues who are absolutely selfless and believe, understand the impacts of trauma that our law enforcement officers go through and are non-judgmental. And I credit so much of this to my brother Chuck and everyone else who's been on the team to help, because I would not be here if it were not for any of them. So, uh, you know, and to be honest, it's inspiring to hear you being a law enforcement officer and sergeant in the sheriff's department who is highlighting these things. I mean, it's not just me or our team. I mean, it takes a community, it takes a village, and so it's great to hear that you're using your platform to discuss the most relevant issue, in my opinion, in law enforcement today, which is wellness and leadership. How do we change our culture, because things do have to change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it just goes right to what I was saying at the beginning of our talk here, where, you know, this has been a hell of a year for everybody.
Sure.
And it's either exacerbated an existing problem for many people, or it's presented an entirely new problem people never expected that they would have to deal with. And
100%.
so, yeah, every person who's wearing a badge right now has gone through some significant events this year. Not
Sure.
necessarily traumatic, but I'm willing to bet if you've been in the job and you've done your shifts that you've experienced traumatic things, and you may have processed them well, you may not have.
Sure.
But everything else is compounded in this year. And I feel it too. And I get emails all the time from people who feel it too.
Yeah.
And if we don't put light on it, if we don't put sunlight on it, we're never going to fix it. Right.
Exactly right.
And not only are we never going to fix it, I'm never going to solve it for myself or anybody else. And the mission I'm on is to make sure that we each have all the information we possibly can to be as successful as we possibly can.
Absolutely.
And I get to benefit from talking to people like you who, every conversation we've had, I've left inspired by your willingness to be completely open and vulnerable. And then not only open to what you've experienced, but then turning around and helping the next person
Wow.
through the Resiliency Project. And I think that's what's missing so often in these stories. We hear someone who's done something, they screwed up, but they're on the mend. But how
Mhm.
can we 10x the result in that? And we do that by telling the story, and we do that by going out there like you are and teaching the classes. And I think it's just an awesome show of respect from Chino PD that they have you and they're hosting the classes that they are. So, I want people to learn more about you, Nick, and learn about your project. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. They can go to the resiliencyproject.info. We're going to be coming out with an awesome new website here in the next couple of weeks, but people can go there to request support or see what we're about. And they can also go to our Instagram, which is at let's see, what is it? Uh, the _resiliency project. And check us out there. I told you that I never had a hobby or a passion, and part of my self care work sometimes I learned how to make videos, and initially I started making videos when my family left about my son because I missed him, and I decided that I was gonna start an Instagram before I even started the Resiliency Project as a nonprofit, and making videos about mental health and law enforcement issues. And so those are the videos that I make just on my phone that we put on the Instagram profile that people can check out. And we're always here 24/7 to help our first responders with anything that they need. So
That's fantastic. And we'll put links in the show notes, of course, for this too, so people can go to thesquadroom.net and find your information. We'll have it
great,
there.
thank you.
Nick, thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the show and just your honesty and your willingness to step out there. I talk on this show often, if not all the time, about the importance of being the one, and how it's incumbent on all of us in our own lives, wherever we are, to be the one that people look to, the one that leads in front, the one that shows the way, the one that sets the example. And I just think you're a fantastic example of someone who's out there being the one. So thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for that, and likewise, that goes both ways, and because you're creating a platform for these discussions that are invaluable to be had, and for it just to reach one person out there, hopefully, you're providing that avenue. So thank you for your leadership and all that you're doing to add value to this conversation.
It's my honor. All right, thanks for listening to this episode with Nick Wilson. If you want to know how you can support the show, there's a few ways you can do that. If you like what you heard today and if you got something out of this conversation, please consider leaving a review on the podcast player of your choice. Please also leave a comment with your review too. It helps us make this show better. Second, share this episode or any episode you have that you enjoy with a loved one or someone who needs to hear these things. You can share your favorite episodes right from our webpage at thesquadroom.net and from most podcast players. Also, there are some great companies who support the podcast and support you as well. Go to thesquadroom.net/support to see exclusive deals from Signature Coins, Hard to Kill Fitness, Onnit, Ranger Up, Hardhead Veterans, and Audible. And of course, join our Facebook group and follow me on Instagram at The Squadroom. A special thanks to our sponsor for today's episode, Signature Coins. If you're looking for a challenge coin for your agency or specialty unit, check them out at signaturecoins.com and use the coupon code THESQUADROOM, all one word, for $50 off. That's where I went for my coins, and they turned out fantastic. If you're shopping at Ranger Up or rangerup.com, don't forget to use the coupon code THESQUADROOM to get 10% off your order. And if you're looking for the best fitting ballistic helmets that exceed NIJ standards and won't break the bank, check out hardheadveterans.com and use the coupon code SQUADROOM to get $20 off your helmet. To keep up to date on our mailing list, or to keep up to date on shows, join our mailing list. You can do that by going to our website at thesquadroom.net. And there's going to be a lot of stuff coming in 2021. This will be the last episode for the year. We're taking a little break going into the holidays and New Year. And we're coming back stronger and bigger and faster than ever. So stick with us to be looking forward to some amazing things we have planned for 2021. All right, everybody stay safe out there. Take your time. Watch your calls. Watch each other's back. Take care of each other. And stay safe. Okay, until next time, take care of each other and stay safe.